blast from the past with the crest of pinball's golden age. Gordo?
Thank you very much. Folks, thank you for coming. I hope you'll find this interesting and maybe to some extent entertaining. I don't want people to be thrown off by the fact that I've titled this the Golden Age, because I'm the first to recognize that every pinball enthusiast has his or her own golden age, usually based on the time period when they were the most active player. But there's some very special circumstances surrounding the mid-century of last century. The Gottlieb games of 1954, as it says up there, following World War II, American pinball entered its golden age. This is an attempt to explain the significance of that magnificent era. And I think after you've seen what I had to say, you'll understand why I feel that this is a particularly realistic assessment of the development of pinball. I'm going to first take you into the Wayback Machine, and we're going to go all the way back to the founding of the game. Oh. What are we doing here, Ron? Do I have it off? I'm sorry. Thank you, sir. Okay. This is a bagatelle table, and as you can see on the left, quote from my good friend and mentor, the late Dick Buchel, the French, who came to help us during our revolution, brought these things to the Americas. And I guess not in that form, no standard or uprights, but the board itself, and they bring it in their knapsacks or their rucksacks. How did it come about? Well, this guy, the Comte d'Artois, who later became Charles X, owned his own chateau. That was the Chateau de Bagatelle. This guy was kind of a wastrel. He did a lot of drinking and carrying on with the ladies. But one way or another, he or people under his thumb designed this game, and he named it after his chateau. So that was the naming of the game. Here we see a Victorian Christmas card of children playing bagatelle. Moving right along, we get to what most consider the real, genuine antecedent of our existing game, improvements in bagatelle by a guy who was originally an Englishman, came to the States, and his name was Montague Redgraves. And the improvements that he made were, and believe it or not, sound, a bell, an incline, and a spring-loaded ball shooter. Now, there were many interim kinds of inventions between improvements in bagatelle. This is one that was fairly notable because it was used with a coin. And this was invented, the coin game board, by Charles P. Young in New York, PA. Charles is no relation that I know of to my partner Steve Young, but he was an important factor in the development of the game. Here we see the Young Republicans of York, PA. Okay. 31 was a seminal year. Dave Gottlieb, who previously had been traveling Texas in his Model T Ford, selling punch boards to cowboys and one-walling movies and inhospitable places and doing other things, somehow found his way back to Chicago. And he took advantage of this new interest in gaming and diversions during the Depression, and came up with a game called Baffleball and one called Bingo. His previous, some bugs here, his previous coin-op experience was with his grip tester, which went all the way back to 29, which was really the founding of his company. But these were the very early games. They were usually run on a penny nickel. And during the Depression years, oftentimes the revenue from these games were what allowed some of these small merchants to keep their candy stores or tobacco shops or whatever open. But Dave Gottlieb was not alone. He had a competitor, and that competitor was Bally. And where do you think they got the name for that game? Well, it was a humor magazine that existed at the same time. And not only did they steal the name, they actually stole the graphics. And there is Ballyhoo. Ray Maloney was the man behind it. Actually, his original company was Lion Manufacturing, later incorporated into a larger corporation, the Bally Company. These things sold for about $17.50. It's said that both Ballyhoo and Dave Gottlieb's first game sold enormous quantities, like 50 to 75,000 of them. If indeed this is the case, that would be like 875,000 to 1.3 million in those days. So these guys were making a fair chunk of change. Here's a great shot of our friend Clark Gable and his then wife, Carol Lombard, and an unknown third person playing a bagatelle. Carol Lombard, some of you may know, lost her life in an airplane crash. She was returning from a fundraising campaign for the government during the war, and unfortunately her plane went down. She was involved in one of those small planes, and she flipped a coin with somebody for a spot on the plane, and unfortunately she won the spot and went down with the plane. Automatic scoring and cash payouts, that was the next point of development for these games. Here are two representative games, Bally Rocket and Bally Airway. It was just inevitable that these things would end up being gambling machines. Over the course of time, you had games that actually paid out coinage. You had games that paid out in tickets. You also had games, not unlike the later bingo games, where you could accumulate free games and then cash them in for a payout. So it didn't take long for the pinball people to take advantage of the gambling opportunities. Here's a great shot of 1930s players, probably on 1-cent play machines during the depths of the Depression. I love the boater hats. The odious one-ball games, talking about 1935. These things were just, it was like robbing a bank. You got one ball, one shot for a nickel, but you could win large numbers of games at the same time, and of course, they would pay out either in tickets or coins. But by that time, we were really involved in a heavy gambling kind of a culture surrounding pinball. Here's a great example. It's taken somewhere in Florida. 3 Mills 1-2-3s. It was nothing more than a pinball machine or a slot machine disguised as a pinball machine. The Pacific Pinball Museum has one of these on display. It's a very interesting looking piece. And Mills, who was basically a slot machine manufacturer, was a large factor in the early days of pinball. You can imagine that, 3 of them. And we serve fruit juices from the Indian River, I think is what the sign says. Here we have Mayor LaGuardia in New York, who had nothing but bad things to say about pinball. He banned them in New York from 1942 to 76, and this was pretty much coincident with the banning of them in Chicago and in Los Angeles. Very long periods of time when the games were just patently illegal. Another bane of the pinball player was the one-ball horse race games. Same deal, you had one ball, and the play field was divided into 4 sections, Win, Play, Show, and I guess the fourth one was Field. And of course, the win was always the hole at the very bottom of the game, so the big awards could only be collected if you managed to get that ball down to the bottom into the win hole. But again, they were incredibly profitable. Sadly, I had. Oh, let me go back here, folks, if you'll excuse me. On the right, those are all confiscated games. It was taken in a police precinct. Bally was the first one after the war to issue a brand new game, and of course, Bally, with their gambling heritage, went for a one-ball horse race game. On the other hand, Gottlieb's New Daily Races was the very last gambling machine that Gottlieb ever made. Dave Gottlieb, I think, saw the handwriting on the wall. He became violently opposed to gambling. You'll see some photos later of trials taking place at various points in time where Gottlieb's lawyer is comparing and contrasting gambling machines with Gottlieb's pure amusement games. But he was very much against it. It made him somewhat unpopular in the industry because most of his compatriots at the time were still making gambling games well into the 50s, and of course, Bally with their bingos right up to 1960. There's some more examples of, again, Bally bingo games. The bingo, also known as the inline game, had a run from 1951 to 1980. People that were most involved in that were, of course, Bally, although Williams did make a few. I think Williams made Long Beach and Yukon. United was the other major factor. That's United Manhattan, not to be confused with the free flipper non-gambling Manhattan of, I guess, 47. Keeney actually made a couple of bingos. I'm not sure the titles of those. But the genesis of these were two games that Bally made early on. They looked like kind of a circular layout on the playfield, almost like a roulette wheel. And they had 26 holes, numbered holes, and a pop bumper in the center. You had one ball, and you shot that ball. It would come off the pop bumper and ultimately land in one of those holes. And that game was called United's ABC and United's 3-4-5. The typical bingo playfield is, as you see there on the left, and that persisted through the entire time. It was a dodge on the part of the bingo makers to get around the legislation that was increasingly popular with various jurisdictions to eliminate gambling in toto, but a lot of confusion ensued because they dressed these gambling things up in pinball cabinets. And for the unknowing or less than knowledgeable, that was just a pinball machine. They got away with that for quite a long time until the Corpend Act and the Eastland Bill, which all but killed the bingo machines in the U.S. Now, Bally went on for another decade or so, making games for those few areas in this country where they were still legal, in Tennessee, South Carolina, the Eastern Shore of Maryland, City of Las Vegas, and one or two others. But they continued to make the games and sell them in the offshore market well into the 70s, if not later. I asked, how long would it take you to play 999 replays? Or in some of the later games that Bally made, the registers would go up to 9,999. Of course, they had a knockoff button on the bottom of these games, and you would call the proprietor over and say, you know, I got 999 games, I want 999 nickels worth of green stuff, but clearly they were made for gambling. Nobody was going to play off 100 games or 999 games or anything like that. Come on, pal, don't be a loser, try it again. Well, easy for him to say. But oftentimes with these games, and I saw it on occasion, it was kind of sorry, they'd be in bars, it'd be Friday night, guy would walk in, cash his paycheck at the bar, and put the whole paycheck into the machine. And it was really very sad. You know, the family goes without rent, goes without food, but he gets off playing the bingos. Although, on the other side, on the other hand, there were guys that literally made a living playing bingo machines. They knew how to get that number 16 hole in the middle, which was the key to completing lines. Bingo, a no-no. Just look what happens to them. They just end up with the police. Problem was the operators, because the darn things were so incredibly profitable, they'd take the chance. And if they got confiscated, they'd buy new ones. A lot of them were run in private holes, you know, lodges and that kind of thing, where they really couldn't be touched, or in charitable kinds of things like church events where they would use it to get some money for the parish or whatever. But incredibly profitable games, and it wasn't until the advent of the video games that operators were able to enjoy that kind of stream of income. I knew some operators who were operating, the video games, and sometimes they literally go and collect with a metal bucket and a shovel. Matter of fact, I met a guy who got a service call on one of the early video games, and when he got there, the problem was you couldn't put any more coin in it. It just filled to the top. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about non-gambling games and the other course of development. What you're seeing here is Gottlieb's Flying Trapeze, which was their very last non-flipper game, made in October 1947. This is an example of a late non-flipper game from our friend at Williams, Bonanza from November 47. This is beautiful backglass, by the way, by our friend George Millenton. This was the last pre-flipper game by United. It was followed by Wisconsin, which was their first flipper game. It was interesting because Lynn Durant, who was the head of United at the time, with the advent of flippers at Gottlieb, said, I'm never going to make a flipper game, man. It's a fad, never going to happen. Well, finally he caved in, and he was the last of the manufacturers to include flippers in his game. And this was his last non-flipper, followed by Wisconsin, which had flippers. There it is. Literally the biggest thing to happen in the history of pinball to that date. Humpty Dumpty, Gottlieb's first flipper game, the first electromechanically operated flippers. There were some precedents, but they were not electrified. This is really the first of its kind. Interesting backstory on this. Harry Mabs was the designer. Of course, he was the man who claimed authorship of the flipper. And he had wanted to call the game Flipper. And they had gone as far as actually screening back glasses for it. And Dave Gottlieb said, no, we're going to call this game Humpty Dumpty. And I think very wisely, because he followed Humpty with 5 or 6 other games, now known as the Fairy Tale series. And I think what he was doing was showing the public an image of essentially children's nursery rhymes. And you know, how could they be in any way offensive? So he was trying to do everything he could, distance himself from the history, the gambling history of the amusement pinball, and I think very wisely. There's a shot of Humpty again, the back glass. As some of you may know, the back glass has a light animation where Humpty gets pushed off the top and all of it splats on the red carpet. Another thing to note, if you look at the play field, it very clearly indicates its pre-flipper origins, because the flipper is almost just a novelty thing. It's certainly not used for targeting, which is really when the flipper came into its own, when it became something that was useful and allowed you to target your ball. Here it just allowed you to kind of keep it alive. And all of the Fairy Tale series games followed in that particular mode. They look more alike than they did different. They all had the 6 flippers, 3 on either side. It wasn't until Barnacle Bill, which was the first game after the Fairy Tale series, that we finally started to get some sense of the flipper being used as a targeting device. Well, once Gottlieb got on the bandwagon, Williams followed shortly thereafter with Sonny, and ultimately United woke up, and here's Wisconsin. And look where the flippers are. You see those things that look like flippers at the upper point of the game? Well, the things to the right and the left were United's way of making their flippers. They were 2 metal posts that looked just like the plastic posts, surrounded by a rubber. And they worked the same way as Gottlieb's, but I don't know whether they thought they were doing that to avoid some kind of a legal thing, but Gottlieb never patented the flipper. David Gottlieb believed that what was good for pinball was good for Gottlieb. So we're at a point where everyone, from debutantes to dudes, loves to play pinball. Anybody know who that is? But the stigma of gambling continues to make operating dicey. Now here, these are all amusement pieces. You see a knockout and a Madison Square Garden, 2 Williams All-Star Star Series baseballs. Tucked in behind there is a Williams 4 corners. And I think the game that you can't see, it's backing up to the Star Series is 4 stars, possibly. Anyway, there they are in the police precinct, and those were fairly innocuous replay games. Lots and lots of trials. Rufus King that's Rufus at the microphone, was Gottlieb's kind of white shoe lawyer who did most of the lawyering when it came to these court cases. As you see in the background, there's a world champ, which is a Gottlieb game, replay game. And then you see a bingo to the right, Miss America, and an unidentified one-ball horse race. And he would carefully take the court through the differences and point out that Gottlieb was running nothing but novelty, and these other things were from the devil. Now, I said at the beginning, why did I particularly point out this particular time period as being the golden age for pinball? And I want to kind of take you through it. So don't be offended if your golden age is different from this. I respect that, and will always respect it. One of the reasons that I see this as the golden age, it was the coming of age of pinball. All the features we know today and more had come into existence by the end of pinball's golden age. We had the flipper. More powerful and strategically placed flippers. And bottom of the playfield, Steve Kordick on Triple Action came up with the idea that the place the flipper could be most effective would be at the bottom of the game. And he was the first to do that. Unfortunately, he put him in the wrong direction as far as we as modern players would see it. But he was smart enough to put him at the bottom. Gottlieb ultimately realized the proper position, but they did so only because prior to this game and many others, they had 4 games that were called turret shooter games that had an oscillating rangefinder at the bottom. And the only way that you could really flip them effectively was to position the flippers in what is now known as the modern position. So they did that on the four turret shooter games, kind of went to school and realized that this was the configuration that was most effective and the one that players became most comfortable with, and a goodly number, the majority in fact of their 50s games, used this Gottlieb bottom. We had bumpers. We had dead bumpers, and we had pop bumpers. Pop bumpers were introduced on Saratoga by Williams. They beat Gottlieb to the punch in that particular case. They were also known as bang bumpers, or jet bumpers, or thumper bumpers, or pop bumpers. We had cyclonic kickers, and ironically, the first ones appeared on double feature, but they were up at the top of the playfield, rather than the bottom of the playfield where most of the games today and most of the games post this put them in the position that we know now. We still had examples of, from our perspective, backward flippers, but that would change eventually. That's simply a exploded drawing of the kicker mechanism. Believe it or not, folks, we had ramps. 9 Sisters, back in 1953, Williams game. We had Habit Trails, another Williams game. Skyway, 1954. So, you know, there's nothing new in pinball. We had kick-out holes, progressive kick-out holes on Rocket. We had gobble holes on Arabian Nights, 1953. We had trap holes. We had roll-under gates on Gottlieb's Chinatown in 1952. We even had horseshoe runarounds on Diamond Lil in 1954. So, you know, if you tend to think that these things that you're seeing are brand new, well, for the most part, they had precedence, and they were proven as incentives for repeat play. We had stationary targets at that time. That happens to be Gottlieb's Super Jumbo from 1954. On the right, bank targets, primitive but bank targets, as early as 1951, and that's Gottlieb's Happy-Go-Lucky. Drop targets, 11 years before Williams' Vagabond. They also had it on Wild West. Gottlieb had Wild West, and Minstrel Man had these early forms of drop targets. Bullseye targets. I think that's Gondolier, 58 Gottlieb. Roto targets, which premiered on Majestic, which was a multiplayer, and then on Royal Flush, which was a single-player game. Rollover targets in the form of rollover buttons on Gottlieb's Mermaid, 51. Open targets as early as 58 on Rotopool by Gottlieb, and even disappearing targets, the disappearing pop bumper on Seawolf and Gusher from Williams. We had great animation, notably, probably the most famous of them, Gottlieb's Knockout, 1950, with a little boxing ring where they actually spar. We had the backbox animation as early as 51, Gottlieb's Mermaid, where every time you scored a point, a little fisherman would pull up on his thing, and the mermaids beneath the water had put an old boot on his hook, and that would come up, and you get a little bit of a smile from that. turret shooters that I talked about. This is one of 4 that they made. Select a card. I think I noted down the other ones. Bank of Ball was another. Buffalo Bill was a 3rd. And Just 21 was the 4th. And they were all made in 1950. I think that Just 21 very likely was an homage to David Gottlieb's daughter, Marjorie, and because it was her 21st birthday in 1950. Prior to that, he had made a game, a pre-flipper game called Marjorie, which I'm virtually certain was an homage to her. Recovery shooter. Between the flippers on Poker Face, 1953. Poker Face, kind of a knockoff almost of Queen of Hearts, except because of the recovery shooter, there were 6 holes rather than the 5 on Queen of Hearts. Slot kickers. 1956 got these harbor lights. To the right and the left of the 2 flippers are shooters aimed at the A and the D targets. Recovery shooters. On both sides of Gottlieb's 51 Cyclone, you go into those channels. Oh, geez. And it shoots your glasses off. Anyway, it shoots way back up to the top of the playfield. It's kind of a fun game to play. Spin bumpers. Spinball by Chicago Coin in 48, almost a quarter of a century before Fireball. Auto flippers. To the right and the left of the green flippers are the auto flippers. And when the ball lands in that hole, it closes contacts, and the flippers flip automatically. Kind of a neat feature. Williams did that on COD, Silver Skates, Paratrooper, Times Square, and this game, interesting game, one of the first games I ever played as a kid. It was called 20 Grand, and the holes could spell out, I think it was 5, 10, or 20. And if you spelled out 20, you got 20 replays. We also had ball savers in the form of blocking gates on 1951 Thing, which is a Chicago coin game. Very interesting piece. Takes its theme from a record by Phil Harris, which was #1 on the Billboard charts in 1950, called The Thing. Kicking posts. A real aberrancy here. Gottlieb did it on one machine and one machine only. Those plastic things with the arrows pointing forward. When you push the flipper buttons, that whole mechanism would move forward and launch the ball up the playfield. They had terrible problems with the original ones because the manufacturers who made them used the wrong kind of plastics, and they tended to crack and break, and Gottlieb had to make good on all of that and replace them all. It was also a game where the mechanism did not function as you would have hoped. You know, you couldn't really get it back up the playfield. You just kind of bobble it around. Last time I saw one on location, the operator had put a 2-cent slot on it, so it shows you how popular the game was. Real scoring. A year before Gottlieb's Super Jumbo on Army-Navy and Dealer. Both are fun games. Army-Navy was the first game that I ever owned. We had great cabinet graphics. Terrific, powerful images, which reflected the theme of the game. Williams did that a lot. United did that a lot. Gottlieb never did. Gottlieb went for bold geometrics. In speaking with Wayne Nyan some time ago, I asked him about, did they have their own cabinetry shop? B, did they paint the cabinets, and who designed them? No, they did not want to be in the woodworking business. It's a dirty business. Get sawdust all over the place. They had a cabinet maker, and the cabinet maker did the painting as well. It was said that frequently, if somebody came into Dave Gottlieb's office with a wild tie, he had a little template that was cut in the form of a pinball machine, and he'd set it down on the guy's tie and Sometimes he'd hit on a design that he liked, and he'd photograph it and send it up to the cabinet makers, but they did not make their own cabinets. So we had hot cabinet graphics, and we had even hotter playfield art. Disc jockey on the left, 1952, Williams game. It was one of several games that they made that were combination bingo games or inline games and novelty games, although they weren't payout games and they did not have capacity to accept multiple coins. On the right, a really rare game, Williams 1952 Sportsman, one of just two turret shooter games that Williams made. And the reason it's a real anomaly is that the artwork is by Roy Parker. It was said that Roy Parker never worked for anybody but Gottlieb, but that was only half true. On rare occasions, presumably because George Melenton, who was the artist that did virtually everybody else's pinball machines, was either sick or on vacation or whatever. But this is a Williams game with Roy Parker artwork, and there were a couple of others that he did. I didn't note them down. We also had replays for matching numbers. You can see the star that appears. Where does it appear? I can't see it from here. Oh, under the 80. When the last two digits of your score on these games matched the numbers that came up at the end of the game, you'd win a replay. Now, on the multiple player games, both the 2 and the 4 player games that were Gottlieb games, using real scoring, if the last digit of player 1 and 2, or player 3 and 4, if it's a 4-player game, if either of those matched, you'd get 10 replays, which was a real rush at the time. I mean, you know, and everybody knew that you hit the double match and they'd come running over. You could not get a double match. So even if all 4 of your numbers on a 4-player were the same and the match number came up, you still only got 10 games. But in my estimation, it was a sop to the players in these multiple player games, because the only other way you could win on them was score. There were no features, which was, to me, a great loss. The beautiful thing about most of the 50s games were the multiple ways of winning games. Gottlieb was famous for it. They had many games where there were 5 routes to specials. And to go from that to a game where you only received one way of winning plus the match was hard for a lot of players to swallow, me included. 2-player games, that was the next thing that came along. This is an interesting piece, Gottlieb's Duet. A 2-player game that was made 2 ways. It was made in a standard cabinet, which you see on the left. On the right, you see it in a deluxe cabinet. It was the only game that Gottlieb ever made, the only multiplayer game that appeared in both formats. The genesis of the 2-player game started with Super Jumbo, which was a 4-player game, Gottlieb's first multiplayer ever, and the first multiplayer game from any manufacturer. What Gottlieb found, and they did an enormous amount of promotion, he sent written invitations to his major distributors to come to Chicago, come to his North Costner Street plant, and play this game, because it was a sea change for the business. And they came, and they played it, and they loved it until they saw the price. So he didn't sell many Super Jumbos. Actually, he also made a deluxe jumbo, which was for non-replay areas. But they loved the concept, but they didn't like the money. And Gottlieb's answer was, okay, then we're going to make 2-player games as well. So you pay your money and you take your choice. I was told by a number of people, including Wayne Nyans, that Gottlieb tended to reserve their best multiplayer designs for the 4 players. And which makes sense, because the guy, the operator, the dealer who was willing to spend that extra nickel should get something additional. So the better Gottlieb multiplayer games are the 4 players. The only exception I could think of maybe was Picnic. That could have been a 4-player in my judgment. Oh, let's go back for a minute. On the right, you see Race the Clock, a very, very rare game. It was Williams' first multiplayer. They also came out of the box with a 4-player format. It's a sin. I played one as a kid. I've only seen one other. It's in the collection of Tim Arnold. And it's a bloody shame because it's a terrifically fun game to play. We had high score enablers, like the tilt reset. And that was as early as 51 on Williams' Control Tower. We had million scoring holes. That's Gottlieb's Coronation from 1952. Okay, let's look at some variations on a theme. One-ball play. Another attempt, and a very successful one on the part of Bally, to take people's money away quickly. You got a 1 ball, and the object of the game was real simple. You put out as many of those numbers as you possibly could. If you could put them all out with that 1 ball, you want 100 replays. Well, again, how many people are going to stand there and play 100 replays? Not many, so we go underneath the machine, we push that knockoff button, and the guy who's running the business gives you the money. Gottlieb had Bally had about 5 or 6 variations on this. Beach Queens, Beach Beauties. John, you probably remember some of them too, but made a fortune with them. No flippers. Well, we looked at 1-ball play. This was the bane of existence of players of my era. When Gottlieb came out with 3-ball play. And they did it on their multiplayers for the most part. The 5 balls remained the 5 balls for the single-player games, but see there, ball in play, 1, 2, 3, game over. Players didn't care for that too much. And of course, 5-ball play, that was generally the case. All of their single players were 5-ball players. That was generally the Golden Age standard. Multi-ball plays. Quarter of a century before Jim Patton's Centaur in 1981, you had Bally's Balls of Poppin', 1956. A lot of fun to play, interesting game. They also made a game called Circus and one called Carnival with exactly the same configuration. You could win up to, I think it was 6, was it, John? Yeah. You could have as many as 6 additional balls on that playfield at one time. And every time you collected the extra balls, they just started to build up again. So there were times when it was just absolute chaos. It was chaotic playing that game. And lots of fun. But remarkably, those 3 games were among the very few non-gambling pieces that Bally made during that period. Matter of fact, from 57 through 63, they made nothing but gambling pieces. Then along came Add-A-Ball with Flipper. Nice story behind Flipper. Beyond being the first Add-A-Ball game, which opened up many, many territories where pinball had previously been disallowed because a free game was deemed to be something of value, this got around it because you didn't win free games, you won free balls. This game, Wayne Nyens pushed very hard for it to be named Flipper, and it was an homage to his mentor, Harry Mabs, who had wanted to use the name for Humpty Dumpty originally. We had increasing odds for replays. Dragonette, 1954, had a neat little mechanism. There were 9 of them made in 54, where you could put a second nickel in and double the amount of games that you won. So if you were scheduled on the scorecard to win a game in 5,500,000 and you had inserted that second nickel prior to shooting your first ball, you would get 2 games. And it was kind of it was a gimmick, but it was kind of fun, and the double award games are highly prized by collectors. Generally speaking, the feature was only used when somebody had multiple games on the replay unit and was willing to burn 2 of them, rather than standing there and putting 2 nickels in at a time. But it was a neat feature, and as I said, it appeared on many games. Williams had a similar thing on they call it a star feature, which again allows you to insert 2 coins, and it increased the number of replays you could win in their matching systems. I'm trying to, I did make a note here. QT was one of them, which QT and Star Williams games in the 50s, but Star Pool had the extra coin feature. And then Colors, Peter Pan, and Spitfire were all Williams Star feature games, accepting multiple coins. Then we had monster odds for payoffs. Again, you can see for 5 on the line on this particular bingo, 600 games. Again, you play 600 games. One of the things, and this is one of the reasons I feel so strongly about the games of this era, was that there were up to 5 ways to score replays. On Dragonette, you could see you could win on points, you could win on score. There was an A-B special at the bottom of the play field. If you put both of those out, it lit the top rollover for a free game. There was a 1 to 8 sequence special. If you spelled that out, again, it lit rollovers for specials. And you could win on trap holes by either forming a square with the 4 or filling all 5 of them for 2 replays. But this was typical. Queen of Hearts is another game with 5 ways to win replays. And it went beyond that in that you could win 10, 12, 25, even 26 replays at once on some of these games. You see Frontiersman there. If you lined up all of the 4 ABCDs, 4 letters in line at their highest point and dropped the center hole, you won 10 replays. Over here from Jalopy, which was a takeoff on not horse feathers, hay burners. If you got your jalopy across the finish line in the first ball, you got 25 replays. And here's the granddaddy of them all, Sweet Adeline. If you put out all of the rollover lanes on Sweet Adeline, you won 26 games. And the thing just went all the way up until the reel stopped at 26. Super special. The only game that I'm aware of that Gottlieb or anyone else did that. The rows of adding tapes, Wayne Nyans took those numbers right off of a bingo game. Okay, let's ask again, why was the Golden Age gold? Well, most of the founding fathers of the pinball manufacturing companies were still with us. There's Dave Gottlieb, who founded Gottlieb. Harry Williams, who founded, of course, Williams. Ray Maloney, who founded Valley. Sam Ginsberg, who founded Chicago Coin. And as I mentioned earlier, his 3 brothers, the Ginsberg brothers, founded Genco. Jack Keeney founded Keeney. They made mostly gambling equipment, but they did make a number of pinball machines. David Rockola, who was very influential at the beginning with the totally mechanical games, and he produced Army-Navy, World Series, and World's Fair Jigsaw, and those were acknowledged as the 3 neatest, most fun games of the all-mechanical age. Very prized by collectors, and even though they were made in huge volumes, they're still tough to find. David Rockola, as you might intuit, is best known for jukeboxes. All the Rockola jukeboxes were out of his factory, and the name continues. The Rockola name is still alive with Glenn Streeter, who makes jukeboxes to this very day under that name. We also had J. Frank Mayer, who founded Exhibit Supply. Exhibit made pinball machines through, I believe, 1951. Their last game was Trigger, but they continued in the arcade business. They made card dispensers and love meters and that kind of stuff. And then our friend Gary Stern's dad, Sam Stern, who was involved in both William Stern and Chicago Coin. Another reason why the Golden Age, I think, was golden. The two legendary guys, the two legendary pinball artists who literally defined the look of pinball were working and at the height of their productivity. On the left, you see the very seldom depicted Leroy Parker, and on the right, George Millenton. Parker did indeed work only for Gottlieb, with those few exceptions that I mentioned earlier. And George, who I knew personally before his passing, George worked for everybody else. Did all the bingos for United and for Bally. He did Chicago Coin. He did everybody's art. Let's take a look at their styles. There's Parker on the left. Now, Parker was much more in the mode of the cartoonist. He had a very cartoony look to his stuff. It was almost like the kind of stuff you'd find in the early Mad comic books, like Will Elder and Wally Wood, and those artists. He was in that tradition, whereas George was more in the tradition of the fashion illustrators that you would find in magazines when illustrations were used for covers rather than photographs. But a much softer approach in terms of the women. They're more soft and vulnerable. Parkers are usually a little bit on the bimbo side, which of course players didn't care about. They thought that was great. Here are other examples. Parker on 53 Gottlieb Grand Slam. Millenton on 52 Williams Four Corners. Four Corners was one of those combination inline and replay games, but it did not accept multiple coins. Parker again with Joker, one of his most beautiful pieces, a huge painted mural of Joker is in the possession of our friends at the Pacific Pinball Museum. It's one of... Ed, did you do Joker?
Yeah.
Yes, you did. Ed, right there. Ed, stand up and receive a hand. Super talented mural artist. Wonderland, again by Millenton, 1955. Obvious takeoff on the Disney Alice in Wonderland cartoon feature of a couple of years previous to that. I like to think of Wayne Nyans, the designer of virtually all of Gottlieb's stuff in the 50s, and Roy Parker as a combination. I like to think of them in the same vein as Sir John Tenniel and Lewis Carroll when they collaborated on Alice in Wonderland. And there we are. Does it get much better than that? Tenniel and Carroll, 1865. Parker and Nyans, 1952. Doesn't get any better than that. Okay, the designers. Let's spend a minute looking at them. Wayne Nyans. In about a month, Wayne is going to have his 100th birthday. I'm going to be one of the people there to celebrate it with him, God allowing. One of the, in his estimation, his finest game. I share that feeling. Queen of Hearts, 1952. 5 ways to win, beautiful graphics, and at the top of his game. Harry Williams, one of Harry's great games, Nine Sisters, with that whirligig ramp there on the left. Harry Mabs, inventor of the flipper. You see Harry here working on a prototype of Buffalo Bill from 1950. And you see the big hole there in it, folks? They did that with all the games that they were developing, and they did it so they could see how the mechanisms on the underboard matched or meshed with the mechanisms on the bottom board. A real smart and practical idea. Here's Steve Kordek. Steve passed just a short time ago. He was 100 years old, so designing pinballs must be good for your body. Triple action. I mentioned earlier how he was the first one to move the flippers to the bottom of the game. Harvey Heiss. Harvey worked for years for Genco. Black Gold was one of his better games. Ted Salveson, who used to publish Salveson's Coin Machine Trader, had great things to say about Black Gold. He apparently had a number of them on location up in the Dakotas and thought it was a great earner. Jerry Cosi. Jerry worked for Chicago Coin. He also makes a parallel claim with Mabs as having been the inventor of the flipper. He went so far as to get a patent on his particular design of the mechanism. Sam Stern. Hayburners is one of the games that Sam designed, 51 for Williams. Gordon Horlick. Couldn't find a picture of Gordon, but Gordon did a lot of work for Harry James. Shoo Shoo was one of the games he designed. Shoo Shoo, as a matter of fact, the name Shoo Shoo was a memorial to Harry's miniature something. I don't know whether it was a poodle or whatever it was, but he had a little dog that was named Shoo Shoo. 54. Now, one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about being a golden age is that the things that you saw in Browns behind the arm of Otto Graham beat the Detroit Lions to become the NBA, excuse me, the NFL champions of that year. Let me get caught up here. Heroes captured our imagination. Perhaps none greater than General Eisenhower. We had won the war. He was the man who was both the Army Chief of Staff. He was the commander of NATO forces after that. Before he became our president, he was the president of Columbia University in New York City, and he was a very good president who is starting to get some of the appreciation that was lacking in earlier years. 1954, the Yankee Clipper marries America's sex goddess. Interesting to me that she uses her given name on that document as Norma Jean and then DiMaggio when she was married, of course, to Joe DiMaggio. 54, you knew your mailman and your milkman by name. First class was 3 cents, and mail was delivered twice a day, as was milk to your door. You got green stamps with your groceries. They were ubiquitous. They'd come in long strips, and you put them in the books, and you traded in the books, and you got household appliances and all sorts of things. Couldn't get cash, though. That was the unfortunate thing. It was such a big phenomenon that an African-American group called the T-Birds waxed a song called Green Stamps on Leonard Chess's label. Phone calls cost a nickel. And incidentally, when the phone companies moved from a nickel to a dime, the pinball manufacturers saw that as a great opportunity and justification to move to the dime play, because it had nickel play all the way back in the late 30s. So they jumped on that opportunity, and it seemed less onerous because, well, I mean, the phone company charges you a dime. Why not a dime for pinball? Pinball does too. 5 cents, 5 balls. Yeah, right. No prizes, gambling, or minors. Who do you think played those things? Their target, their avowed target, was the 15 to 25-year-old child, man-child, you know. Fast food's affordable. First Burger King opens in Miami. black and white TV, called for the invention of colorful TV dinners for 99 cents. How good is that? 1954, 3D comic books. They were wonderful. I don't know how many of you have seen them, but they were period things. They only made them in that 53, 54 era, and there were only 50 titles ever published. It was the last year for Dixie Cup lids. Dixie Cups, they still make them, but in those days, every one of the lids had a character on it, and sometimes some of them were cowboys, some of them were movie stars. You see Jerry Lewis, and up there is, who was that? It's not Tex Ritter. Judy Garland, Roy Rogers. Anyway, 54 was the last one of the Dixie Cup lids. Here's the 54 hit parade. Pretty down the middle kind of stuff. That's Rosemary Clooney, for those who don't recognize her. And she is, in fact, or was, the aunt of George Clooney. I worked with one of her sons, who was a voiceover recording artist. Actually, she had two sons. They were both in the business one way or another. His son did some TV commercial voiceovers for me. But you can see it's pretty plain vanilla. However, music changes forever when a poor Memphis truck driver cuts his very first record. Elvis with Scotty and Bill, and That's All Right. Now, these also waxed in 1954. What you see here is the incursion of rock and roll and rhythm and blues. Notably, Rock Around the Clock with Bill Haley and his Comets on Decca, and Elvis, and then Johnny Ace. Those of you who remember that far back, Earth Angel, Cleveland Duncan and the Penguins, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, Big Joe Turner. So you see some of the R&B and the R&R coming into its own. It was a great year for Broadway. Here we see Paul Newman. He played the leading role in Picnic as the Drifter, Hal Carter. Some of you might remember The Bad Seed, the little girl who ended up killing her playmate. It was a great year for theater, for cinema. This is Eva Marie Saint and Marlon Brando on the Waterfront, which was a terrific film. High and the Mighty, Star is Born, Brigadoon. Great stuff. The small screen, that I believe is Reginald Van Gleeson III. The top two shows, and keep these in mind because we're going to go back to them pretty quickly. I Love Lucy on CBS and Dragnet on NBC. The reason we're coming back to them is they were inspirations for pinball games. Comic books were huge, huge. In those days, the most popular titles were Superman, Batman, and Captain Marvel. And typically, each of those superhero titles would have comic book runs each month of upwards of 100,000 copies. 100,000. Today, excuse me, what am I talking about? 1.5 million. A big run today is 100,000. I'm sorry, I couldn't read my own notes. So you can see the way that form of mania has diminished. Boy, it was fun in the 50s. Here's some of the reasons why it diminished. EC Comics, Bill Gaines, who was the publisher of both Mad and Panic, the companion to Mad, had a whole line of horror comics, and they were among the most gruesome and, of course, the most attractive for the kids. The Crypt Keeper and the Old Witch from the TV Tales from the Crypt, it all came from Bill Gaines and his horror comics. Unfortunately, there was a guy named Estes Kefauver, who was a senator from, where was he a senator from? Help me, somebody. Tennessee, I think. Anyway, Kefauver instituted a Senate investigation into juvenile delinquency. And horror comics surfaced very quickly and became a subject of great interest. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Here, 17 years before Cliff's Notes, this is how we got through our English classes with Classics Illustrated. And virtually every one of the classics was dealt with in a easily digestible comic book. It was also a time when the old serials were exposed to new fans. The Flash Gordon serials, and there were 3 of them that were made back in the 30s. You'd go to the movies and you'd see a different episode each time you went. And our friend Buster Crabbe, who had been an Olympic swimmer, a Californian, actually he was born and raised in San Francisco. He was Flash Gordon, but he was also Buck Rogers in those serials. And he was also Tarzan in those serials, so he was the only guy that portrayed all 3 of the most famous comic characters of the 1930s. Tim Tyler's Luck was another great serial. And the guy who played Tim, Frankie Thomas, later became Tom Corbett of The Space Cadet, the early TV space drama. And I'm told that, like Bela Lugosi, who was buried in his Dracula outfit, Tim was buried in his Tom Corbett Space Cadet outfit. It was a great time for sports. In 1954, well, there's Frank Gifford, who to this day I think holds the record for number of touchdowns with the Giants. And football cards were coming into their own. In that year, Bowman was the only one that published them. There were plenty of baseball cards. Here we see Ted Williams on the top of a box of them. You got 5 cards and a bubblegum slab for a nickel. Williams, as many of you may know, was the last man in the modern age to bat over 400. Incredible athlete. It was a new era for magazines. That's the first issue of Sports Illustrated with Eddie Matthews and the Boston Braves at bat. And that first issue had this cardboard insert with all these trade cards in it from players on all of the teams. The second issue had just the same thing, but it was all Yankees. By the way, it took Time Life, I don't know how many years to finally be in the black with Sports Illustrated. They took massive losses in the first 10 or 12 years. It was a new idea. It was a totally new idea. American Motors was born. Hudson and Nash merged. My first car looked just like that, except it was black and red. You can see how primitive Schultz started out at that time. This is the first time Linus's blanket shows up. It was a big year for innovation in terms of automotive. 54 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing, $11,000. You could buy a house for that. And the 54 Corvette available any color you wanted as long as it was polo white. Hemingway won the Pulitzer Prize for The Old Man and the Sea. Took the lead cure a few years later. The old favorites were beginning to fade. The old-timers smoked the unfiltered cigarettes, but the tar derby had begun. And as we were told, Winston stayed good, like a cigarette should. The pedants who took umbrage to the poor grammar said it should be, Winston tastes good as a cigarette should. Filter flavor, flip-top box, that was what sold Marlboro. It was the jet age. New Boeing 707. I loved those uniforms that the Pan Am gals wore. They were really kind of cute. 54, I mentioned before, the Senate comic book hearing took place. A gentleman named Frederick Wortham, who was a psychiatrist, I guess is the terminology, published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And the whole premise of that book was that reading comic books, expressly comic and crime and horror comic books, inevitably led to juvenile delinquency. A lot of the women's publications of the day picked up on this. It became scandalous and eventually led to the comic book industry regulating itself, the Comics Code, which came into existence. And it was the end of all the horror and Okay, top scoring shows of 53 and 54 with Dragnet and I Love Lucy. And don't you know, Dragonette from June of 1954 was an obvious takeoff on Dragnet, which had started as a radio show and then evolved into a television show and was one of the most popular shows and one of the shows along with Milton Berle's Comedy Hour and I Love Lucy that were responsible for the explosion in television sales at that time. So Dragonette, let's take a look at Dragonette. Parker and Nyans working their magic. You see the factory photo on the left, the distributor flyer on the right. And here's I Love Lucy, the takeoff here, factory photo of lovely Lucy. And the somewhat risque distributor flyer. It's probably about as risque as they got in those days. There were other TV tributes, interestingly enough. Here we see an early TV, and here we see Gottlieb's homage to the TV, telecard, where the numbers are displayed on a television screen. Telecard was followed by an identical game except for the graphics, and in that game was Gin Rummy, which was made in very limited numbers. Back to Lucy. Remember Lucy and the Vitamina Benjamin? And here we see her in the back glass, and of course the background is representative of Ricky's band, her husband Ricky, who was a Cuban. Another TV send-up, What's My Line? You probably remember that. It was a long-running panel show where they tried to guess the person's occupation, and Gottlieb ripped it off as Watch My Line, which is kind of funny because the panel was frequently stepping on each other's lines, so they were playing on that. It was a distinguished group of panelists. One of them was Dorothy Kilgallen, who wrote a syndicated column which appeared in hundreds and hundreds of papers. And Dorothy died untimely and probably was murdered because she was the only person who had gotten a face-to-face interview with Jack Ruby and was about to release what was billed as an absolute bombshell of a book, which was going to reveal things about the Kennedy assassination that went unknown because she died mysteriously in her Manhattan apartment at a very young age. So a lot of controversy. Bennett Cerf was on that. Steve Allen was on that particular panel. Frontiersman. King of the Wild Frontier. Again, taken from the four-part Disney special on Davy Crockett. They couldn't call it Davy Crockett, of course, but they could certainly take the... How many guys had a coonskin hat? Anybody? Yep, I did. Just one, just two. Wagon Train. They even ripped off the type style. What do you think about that, Ed? And if you look at the playfield, the main character looks like anybody remember the sponsor? No. 40 Mule Team Borax. Okay, back to Dragonette. This is a city, Los Angeles, California. I work here as a cop. And we see Joe Friday and Officer Frank Smith. And here's the back glass of Dragonette. I have a bit more to say about that. Jack Webb and Ben Alexander were the real names of the two characters. What you'll find in a lot of back glasses by Parker was a comic book style, again, not unlike what you saw in the early Mad comic books and Panic comic books. lot of verbal and visual puns. I'm going to go into that in a minute. It's interesting because upon close examination, and unfortunately there isn't a game on the floor here, I wish there were, but there are a lot of nifty little things going on, and a lot of them have to do with sexual innuendo. There's a little bit of voyeurism, there's a little bit of transvestitism, and generally some sexually oriented references. It's a bit of a bawdy backlash. For instance, the gentleman in the Sherlock Holmes deerstalker cap and the pipe is, just want the facts, ma'am, the bare facts, ma'am, of course, short for mammary. This gentleman here, worm's eye, view my eye, he's shooting a shot under the girl's skirt, as is Sergeant Friday down there with his sergeant stripes on his sleeve. He's taking another shot. Even the parrot is looking down her ample cleavage. Parroting the TV show that originated as a radio program, earnest interrogation, the facts, man, just the facts. He possibly should be asking, is that just a 38C? Sergeant Friday is a real drag. He's dressed in drag, it's ridiculous. We have 50 transvestites on the other panel. Sadism plays a little part in this too. The two characters, other than the detectives, are really emblematic of the French posh dance, which was based on French kind of street life, fashioned after a pimp and his prostitute. And it was a legitimate form of dance, but that was the origin of that art form, the criminal element in France. Oh, worm's eye, view my eye. Voyeurism there. This is an interesting piece. On the door in the back of the back glass, there's an inscription, a written inscription that says, "Don't open the door. Don't open the door, Richard." And that was a takeoff on a popular skit, which was originated at the Apollo Theater in Manhattan, which catered primarily to an African-American audience with African-American entertainers. And Dusty Fletcher came out of the old Chitlin circuit, and he and Moms Mabley and some of the other famous African-American entertainers were famous for this skit called "Open the Door, Richard." And that's parodied there. And interestingly enough, there was also a #1 record in 1947 called "Open the Door, Richard." Let me see, how we doing here? Well, we're all right. I'm going to have to speed it up a little bit. We got a suggestion that maybe the environment for them is one of lots of drinking. We've got a hip flask in the sergeant's pocket. You see 3 types of barrels of cheap wine in the background. I love the fact that the investigation is so thorough that there are 900,000 facts. Each one of those says fact number. There's the parrot with his down blouse shot, and there he appears again on the playfield again, looking straight down at our heroine. And these ladies of the time are perhaps responding to some degree to the fact that this is a little bit of an off-color glass. This is a photorealistic painting by the late Charles Bell, which he did from the playfield of my Dragonette right down to the curves in the warping plastic. Wow. Dragnet spawned a lot of sensational satire. Stan Freberg did a #1 billboard and Cashbox a comedy record called St. George and the Dragonette. Mad Comics did two different stories, which they called Dragnet. This was Dave Gottlieb's Ace in the Hole. Dragnet was a songstress primarily during the 30s. She had her own show on radio. She was a major star. She had her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And I think he did this defensively. She used to do a lot of the chicken and tea dinners that the industry would do, and she would come and entertain, so she was well known to industry folks. And I think he had her in mind when he called her Dragonette because of Jack Webb, who was very litigious and protective of his intellectual property. Everyone tried to do anything. David said, no, I just named the game after my good friend Jessica Dragonette. So there she is. She wrote, there's a biography about her, it's pretty interesting. Daisy May, another thing came right out of the culture of the 50s. Al Capp did his Little Abner, which spawned all sorts of offshoots, whether it be theater plays or movies. Here's the game, here's the flyer, here's their creator. He was syndicated in, I don't remember the number, I'll literally have to look it up, but he had a 43-year run in 900 newspapers around the country. I mean, Little Abner was everywhere. A literary lion as significant as John Steinbeck once recommended Al Capp for a Nobel Prize in Literature. He was a very smart, very witty, very intelligent guy, and his things were a hoot. And I love the fact that Capp satirized Chester Gould, who did Dick Tracy with his Fearless Five. Here are the inhabitants of Dogpatch, and Little Abner Yoakum, and Daisy May Scraggs. And ultimately they got married, and it was such a big event that they appeared on the cover of Life magazine. And they got the royal treatment. They got the wedding ceremony with the big firecracker, which was $1.35. And of course, Abner doesn't pay, Daisy May does. There's Daisy May in the back glass of her game, right there in Hillbilly Heaven. There's no place like home. Strikes a striking pose for us. Of course, the M-A-Y was another sexual innuendo, as in if, Daisy May, or then again she may not. And again, a way of getting around the correct spelling of her name, which is M-A-E. Oh no, we weren't talking about Daisy May. Here's another Gottlieb attempt to do something rather countrified and hillbilly-like. Gottlieb's 48 Harvest Moon, limited production game, backglass detail. Shantytown by Exhibit, another one in that same genre. Here we see Kickapoo Joy Juice being made by Fearless Joe and Lonesome Polecat, who were featured in Little Abner. And we see the two hillbillies there having a liquid lunch and probably drinking Kickapoo Joy Juice. Dogpatch Debutantes, well, she's the resident one, and this one is just a visitor from Four Corners. But you can see this hillbilly with his jug of moonshine. Just a good look at Daisy May. Point out a couple of things. A couple of pranksters are pushing over the outhouse, and of course, if you tilt the game, it lights up right to the left of it in that bubble. You see a woman in the background with a net, trying to net herself a husband on what was it called? Help me. Sadie Hawkins Day. And there's a gentleman there with his entire family. He's got his wife, he's got his little baby, he's got his dog, and yet he has the crust to stand there and take photographs of Daisy May. How he got away with it, I'll never know. Wanted to show you this just because it was so cool. This is the way Cap drew Moonbeam McSwine, who was a greater lover of the pig pen than her hillbilly swains, and Frank Frazetta on the left, who is legendary. Daisy May, once again, not too much more to say about. Here's Sadie, her own self, after whom Sadie Hawkins Day was named, you can understand why her father was pushing for this kind of a celebration, hoping that she would net herself a worthy swain. Did you know that little Abner was employed? Well, he was. He cut those crescents in the outhouse doors. That's what he did for a living. Pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, in a minute, I will tell you the very name of his employer. It was the Little Wonder Privy Company. Little Wonder Privy Company. Not too much more to say. Lots of ways to score. Again, score, points, kick-out holes, ABCD rollovers, and advances. 5 different routes to specials. The hallmark of Wayne Dye's games. Point of interest, you see a cockfight going on in the middle of the playfield. A blood sport, which is now outlawed in all 50 states. The last one to do it was Louisiana. But it still exists in today's day and age as the South Carolina Gamecocks with the Fighting Spurs on the bird. It's a clever and unique game. It's got 4-leaf clovers that designate the rollovers on either side. It's got 4 flippers, and it's got 4 pop bumpers. One last game I want to take a look at very quickly, Super Jumbo from October '54. Again, a game which took its theme from something within the surrounding popular culture. And that was Jumbo the Elephant, which for years was a star of P.T. Barnum's circus. And the quote up there is from him in his typical showman-like way. Jumbo, the largest quadruped on earth. He's richly worth $1 to behold, the king's soul of his mighty race. And $1 in those days, can you imagine?
That's a lot of money.
Jumbo was a huge African elephant. He stood about 13 feet tall. And I think from what I've been able to determine, Barnum paid $10,000 for him, which today would be $250,000. Jumbo was the biggest thing in pinball since the flipper. It was introduced with a 4-page kind of a brochure. There's page 1, 2, 3, and 4. Presumably those elephant signatures there were places where it was tested on location. There's the factory photo, the billboard ad. After introducing the multiplayer game, Gottlieb began to do one multiplayer, one single player, one multiplayer, one single player. As we see here, August '55, 2-player tournament, September '55, single player wishing well. 2-player marathon, October '55, November, single player frontiersman. It was an operator's dream. They could set it on 3, 4, or 5-ball play, and you could have 1, 2, or 3, 4 players playing it. Notice it was 10 balls, and this operator had it set on 3 balls for a dime. It had a double match award, which I talked about previously. I don't think you can do that again. On the left, you see the non-replay version, which was called Super Jumbo. It was an identical game, but you could not win replays. And the combination, as I told you, they had a tough time selling that game originally because of the price point. The combined sales of the two was about 500 units, which was a small one. The tray liner on that with the elephants at the bottom is the original tray liner. I've never seen an original. Just as a point of reference, the 5, 10, or 25 cents that you might spend in these multiple games, multiple player games, would translate to 46 cents, 92 cents, and $2.29 in today's market. Here we see a Super Jumbo in the background with one of the original marquees on top of it, talking about how it's much more fun to compete. And of course, at the front, at the gun, we have our friend Elvis. There were 2 and 4-player antecedents long before Gottlieb came along. There's Bally's Jack and Jill in '33, Genko's Double Track 38, Horse Feathers 52 from Williams, I can't remember. Twin Hockey, that was a prototype game that Gottlieb made. Never went into full production, but it was a multiplayer game. 4-player antecedents, Derby from Chicago coin, 1951. One last game and then we're out of here. Diamond Lil. The precedent for that was a Mae West play, which she both wrote and starred in. I love her quote, "I used to be Snow White, but I drifted." She was quite the entertainer. She played that role for the first time when she was in her 20s and played the same role later when she was nearly 40 on Broadway. At one time in the 30s, her income was second only to William Randolph Hearst, so she was enormously popular and profitable. It was later made into a movie where she co-starred with Cary Grant called She Done Me a Job. She Done It Wrong, the movie version. Funny bit, he plays an FBI agent, she plays a madam. Here's the game. Some people say that's Dave Gottlieb with a cigar and a derby, but Wayne Lyons claims not. There's some playfield plastics. The diamond that they use is the old, what they call continental cut, which would have been a style that probably the Gottlieb manufacturers and their wives would have worn at that time. It's got that lovely horseshoe run around, and those lights illuminate as you go around. It's a terrific little light show. And here we have Elvis playing Diamond Will. I'd like to dedicate this to my late friend, Dick Buchel, who was an absolute titan in terms of not just pinball history, but coin-op history in general. He was monumental, and his loss was monumental. There will never be another like Dick. He knew more about more things than any human being I've ever met. And I'd like to also dedicate it to, in my judgment, the #1 pinball designer of all time, my good friend Wayne Lyons. Here's Wayne being blessed on his 96th birthday when his wife Muriel was still living. And thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, we are able to take questions from anybody who's interested. If you would, raise your hand and a gentleman with a mic will come around. So please speak into the mic because we're recording this whole thing. Thank you.
I've got a question that I haven't been able to find an answer to about Watch My Line.
Okay.
1951, Harry Mapps, the inventor of the flipper, the last game he designed for Gottlieb had no flippers. The irony is just unbelievable. And I would have thought it would have been like a dirty trick, but I understand he didn't really leave on bad terms with David Gottlieb. So I'm wondering if you might have any information.
I honestly don't. To be perfectly honest, I was not aware, top of mind, that that was his last game. And indeed it is.
Yeah, well, it's my understanding as far as I can tell.
My feeling was that it was just as those Williams games, the ones that were the combination bingo and replay, it was in response to the huge success of the inline games at the time, and an attempt to see if it would work for them. Of course, it was not a multiple coin game, but I don't know. When I said he left under less than amicable terms, I mean, I don't think he went stomping out of there, but his nose was out of joint. He expected that David was going to pay him some kind of a reward, but David's was generally, not generally, David's rule was he paid a very healthy bonus to everybody at the end of the year, period, paragraph, no exceptions. And I guess Harry took some offense at that, and I think he also maybe felt the pressure of a much younger designer tracking his heels in the guise of Wayne Lyons. But it's an interesting perspective. Honestly, I don't know. Whether he did it in spite or whether it just happened to be.
Incredible irony.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that factors into it, which makes it difficult to say something definitive, is there were always 3, 4, 5, 6 games in line that had already been designed and prototyped and ready to go, and then David and his executive committee would decide the order in which they were released. So heaven knows when Harry may have designed that game. You really don't know. Best answer I can give you.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I have a question regarding Bally bingo machines.
Yeah.
With the three digit device.
Yeah.
Suppose a player got very lucky and racked up 890 credits, and then his next game he was able to maximize the scoring to over 1,000 credits. Would the meter roll over to 1,000?
No.
Or would it stop at 999?
No, and I think that's why they introduced in some of the later games those 4 digits. I can't imagine it happening often, but if it had happened on a 3-digit, that was it, 999.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
So Roy Parker, is there any of his original artwork left?
Somewhere I don't have, excuse me. The answer is yes, and the only piece of it that I'm aware of is in the hands of David Silverman, who had the museum in Baltimore, which sadly went bust. I believe he had a piece of original artwork from Lady Robin Hood, Gottlieb's second flipper game. Other than that, none that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much, folks. Before you go, I'd just like to, I am not affiliated in any legal or any other way with the PPM, the Pacific Pinball Museum, but I did donate my collection to them, and I'm an advocate for them, and I just want to take 2 minutes to say to you folks that if you know anyone that you think might be interested in being a mentor, what I'm really asking is, do you know anybody with deep pockets who might be interested in being an angel to help these guys get to the next step in their development? They're doing a great thing for pinball. They're doing it well. Your museum, the way it exists today, is running just smooth as it can be, but they have bigger ambitions. They need bigger space that they can own. And if you guys know anybody with real deep pockets or a corporation that you might work for that might be interested in some kind of sponsorship, please speak to Michael Sheese or to Larry Zartarian. And finally, if you have any interest in a book that I'm about to publish at some point, there's a sign-up sheet in the back, and if you leave your name and email address, if and when I publish it, I'll send you an email. No obligation, and thank you for your attention. I appreciate your attendance. Thanks.